Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to St. Thomas More College. For anyone who might be new to this place, we are the Catholic Liberal Arts College at the University of Saskatchewan, and we've been on this campus since 1936, thanks to the visionary work of our founders, the Basilian Fathers. My name is Carl Still, and I serve as president of the college today. As we gather here this evening in the Father O'Donnell Auditorium, we gratefully acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory in the traditional homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and their descendants, and we reaffirm our relationship with one another. As a Catholic college, we have committed ourselves to being a reconciling community led by the ideals of holistic interconnectedness and accountability, beautifully expressed by the Cree concept of Wahkohtowin. We are grateful for all the partnerships that help us build capacity to play our role in the great national work of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. May our walking together lead us to the reconciliation that we seek for ourselves and the generations that come after us. So thank you all for being with us this evening, all of you here in the auditorium, and all of you joining us online for the first lecture in the 2025 Margerie Ecumenical Lecture Series. Over the past 12 years, the Margerie Lecture has moved around the calendar, as you might know, but tonight it's back where it started, and maybe back where it really belongs, in the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity. I mentioned partnerships, and this year's lecture continues partnerships forged in recent years. This Margerie Lecture is jointly sponsored by the Leslie and Irene Dubé Chair in Catholic Studies at St. Thomas More College, the Saskatoon Theological Union, the Prairie Center for Ecumenism in Saskatoon, the Roman Catholic Diocese of Saskatoon, Campion College at the University of Regina, and the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Regina. The lecture series is inspired by its namesake, Father Bernard de Margerie, one of the founders of the Prairie Center for Ecumenism and an inspirational ecumenist for all of us. The annual De Margerie Ecumenical Lecture Series represents yet another way that we as Christian communities engage in dialogue with one another and explore the faith that we hold in common, albeit in distinct communities. As we look back 1,700 years to the Great Council of Nicaea in 325 and consider what it may mean for us today, I hope this will be an opportunity for renewed ecumenical dialogue and fellowship for all of us. So thank you again very much for being here. And at this point, I will invite Nick Jessen to come forward and give us some background about the De Margerie Ecumenical Lecture Series. Nick.
Thank you, Carl, and good evening, everyone. It's so nice to be back in Saskatoon this evening, and particularly, I've been looking forward to this series for, well, most of the year since we asked Sandra to do this. This series of lectures, the De Margerie series, began in 2012, as Carl said, and is dedicated to Father Bernard de Margerie. A priest of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Saskatoon, Father Bernard was a leader in ecumenism in Western Canada, beginning when he was a young curate. In 1959, the newly ordained young priest heard Pope John XXIII's announcement of Vatican II as a personal charge. He sought permission from his bishop to study ecumenical theology at the Angelicum in Rome, where he lived through the days of the Vatican Council. On his return to Saskatoon, he resumed parish ministry, but also began to establish close relationships with leaders of other churches. Together, they built a vibrant ecumenical community in Saskatchewan. In 1984, Father Bernard established the Center for Ecumenism as an ecumenical office of the Roman Catholic Diocese. However, from the start, it had an interchurch board and mandate. By 1988, the center had matured to the point of formally becoming an ecumenically sponsored center, eventually representing 7 denominations. It is one of only 2 centers in Canada, and it is unique in its focus on local parish ecumenism and ecumenical formation. We are now in the 12th series of lectures, and you probably will remember a number of the speakers that we have had over the years, beginning with Bishop Gregory Cameron from the Church of Wales in 2012, who spoke about how a vision of communion changes ecumenism. I won't tell you about all of the speakers, but you will each have your favorite memories of these each year. Last year, our speaker was the Reverend Dr. Karen Peterson Finch from Presbyterian College in Montreal, who spoke about her experience in local dialogue in Washington State, and she helped us to imagine or to reimagine lay people as stewards of doctrine. From each of the previous series and this year, for each of those previous years, Father Bernard was able to be with us. But sadly, Father Bernard died on March 3rd of last year. We continue this series in his memory and with his encouragement to continue to be agents of Christian reconciliation and unity. No doubt he is listening tonight and joining us in prayer that all may be one in Christ so that the world may believe. I've also been asked to introduce our speaker to you this evening, which is a little bit of a strange request because many of you know her, but let me try it. I'm pleased to introduce somebody that you know. I'm pleased because she is a delightful person whom I have been happy to call a friend for 30 years. I first met Sandra shortly after she and Bill moved to Saskatoon. I was the relatively new and pretty young director at the Prairie Center for Ecumenism, and Sandra had moved here to become the professor of church history and ecumenics at St. Andrew's College. At the first opportunity, the United Church Presbytery appointed Sandra as one of their 2 representatives on the board of the Prairie Center, and so we began to work together frequently. Now, I've worked with many United Church folk over the years, clergy and lay. Like many of them, Sandra has a strong commitment to social justice, to an articulate and thoughtful presentation of Christian faith in wider society, and to the importance of the local community of faith for Christians in the modern world. As a church historian, Sandra is better suited than almost anybody to identify the theological and historical roots of these United Church gifts. But I think that Sandra delights in reminding us of the particular contributions of Methodism within the United ethos, not only in social justice, but in piety and worship. As a self-professed ecumeniac, Sandra has been an easy touch whenever I need someone to give a workshop or write something. She brings a wealth of experience in pastoral ministry as well as rigorous academic study, all with her sense of humor and excitement for the work of Christian unity. By the time she came to us in Saskatoon, her ministry in the United Church had already taken her to congregations in Ontario and Labrador, and she had acquired an enduring interest in ecumenical shared ministries. Her stories of serving in a shared ministry in northern Labrador with Anglicans and Roman Catholics gave us a vision of the way that local ecumenism was supposed to work. Through her teaching and research within the Saskatoon Theological Union, Sandra has helped to form hundreds of ministers for United Anglican and Lutheran churches across the prairies, across Canada, and even around the world. Each of them went into their ministry with a strong encouragement to talk to their neighbors, to knock on the door of the Catholic rectory, and to make sure to go to the local ministerial gatherings. She gave them the confidence that ecumenical engagement is not only responsible, but is essential if they are to be good pastors. Sandra is perhaps the foremost expert on ecumenical shared ministries in Canada. Shared ministries are those with 2 or more denominations sharing in a building, a program, worship, ministry personnel, or some combination of these. Sandra's interest and support have guided the Prairie Center to become a resource bureau for these ecumenical ministries. Yet Sandra's interest in shared ministries went not only as a consultant to these congregations and the national churches, but also led to some important research. She spent a sabbatical term in the UK studying their local ecumenical partnerships, which are somewhat analogous to our shared ministries, but they have developed within a very different civil and ecclesial culture. And you might get her talking about that at some point. I have many happy memories of conferences that she and I have attended together, including the North American Academy of Ecumenists, where we like to gather the Canadian members for a few drinks after in the pub, at least when we weren't on a dry campus. We have a story about that. Another of my favorite memories is working with Sandra on a 5-week Lenten series that we called This Old House, which she and I team taught in a kind of dialogue to explore 5 church reform movements of the last century. Another year, we worked together with a team across Canada to develop the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity materials that were used around the world in 2014. Sandra's ecumenical contributions, though rooted in local ecumenism, have always been offered to the wider church. She has served in various capacities within the church over the years, but it is in the past decade that she's become actively engaged in the Commission on Faith and Order of the World Council of Churches. She was appointed to the commission following the WCC Assembly in Busan, Korea in 2013. The annual meetings and various committees and projects have taken her to far-flung places and given her experience of a wider ecumenism than we see here at home. And she has shared that with us whenever possible. In her last few years on the commission, she joined a committee that was charged with developing plans for commemorating the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. She now convenes this committee and will lead the WCC through the 6th World Conference on Faith and Order that will be held in Alexandria, Egypt in October of 2025. When we asked Sandra to be our de Margerie speaker for this year, we knew that the anniversary of an ancient council could be a very, very dry topic. But Sandra is just the person to bring it alive for us. Sandra rewarded our trust when, clearly thinking the same thoughts, she offered titles that speak to the relevance today of the faith once handed down to the apostles. Are we ready for visible unity? And are we ready to share the apostolic faith together? The 2 lectures today and tomorrow are complementary. Make sure that you come again tomorrow, either in person or online, to hear Sandra as she guides us to Nicaea 2025. And for those of you who want a little more, come to the workshops in either Regina on Friday or Saskatoon on Saturday. They're the same workshop repeated, and they won't be live streamed, so you have to come in person. Workshops need to be in person because ecumenical discussion really works best when we are face to face. Now I welcome Sandra forward.
Well, greetings, friends, and thank you, de Margerie planners, for this gracious invitation to work with you this week. Thank you, Nick, for that over-the-top introduction. That was very generous. Thank you. I have been present for most of the de Margerie lectures in Saskatoon, and they've always been a breath of invigorating January or occasionally March or June or October air. They've opened me to fresh perspectives on the search for Christian unity, to which I know so many of us are dedicated. And this first year, without Father Bernard, as Nick mentions, sharing this earthly life with us, is especially poignant. He was in many ways our ecumenical Polaris, our pole star. His passion, his wisdom, his prayerfulness, his generosity of spirit, and of course his playful and impish grin helped form me as an ecumenist and teacher, as he did others of us here. Now, my husband, Bill Richards, has a degree in astronomy, and he reminds me and others that the North Star does not stay fixed in one place. The place in the sky that the Earth's North Pole points at changes slowly over time. In fact, Polaris was not the North Star at the time of the Council of Nicaea. It only became the North Star about the year 500. I think Father Bernard would like that. He was drawn to matters of faith and cosmology, and he always wanted there to be more ecumenical stars shining in the firmament. He wanted new guides to carry the work. So here we are tonight, friends, you and I, with Father Bernard in our hearts and a whole shining ecumenical year, as the World Council of Churches calls it, ahead of us. And ahead here, speaking ahead. Oh, no, I guess I'll do this. Sorry. Have I missed something here? Just trying to go ahead here. Does this do it? No? Try that. No, there doesn't seem to be a... They want me to just stay on one slide all night. Sorry. Sorry about that. Was it just that was turned off?
It wasn't just in the PowerPoint, so we're good to go.
Okay, thank you. We're good to go. Thank you. So the WCC's Ecumenical Year will commemorate several key anniversaries, including, of course, the 1700th anniversary of the First Ecumenical Council, Council of Nicaea. The largest event will be the 6th World Conference on Faith and Order to take place at the Logos Center, and that's it there, near Alexandria, Egypt. It will include Faith and Order commissioners, 100 students in a program called GETI, or Global Ecumenical Theological Institute, and 100 delegates to be selected from nominations from all the churches in the world, not just World Council churches, with a deadline of the 13th of February for those nominations. So if you want to be nominated, it's time to tell your denomination you'd like to go. Unfortunately, they're trying to keep a range of locations that people will come from. So anybody that, if somebody from your country is already there, then you don't have as much of a chance. I'm sorry about that. But there will be online opportunities, and I'm really committed to those. And the conference will have multiple speakers on 3 themes: faith, mission, and unity. So here comes Nicaea 2025. The week of prayer has inaugurated it, but most of it lies ahead of us. And my plan over our 2 lectures is to help us prepare for this Nicaea anniversary, to take stock, to remind ourselves what Nicaea 325 was, and then to ask how we're doing with regard to Nicaea's key accomplishments. So as you heard from Nick, each presentation will echo a phrase that we coined in the Faith and Order Commission for 2025. So the theme for the World Conference is Where Now for Visible Unity, while the overarching theme for the whole year is Living the Apostolic Faith Together Today. And while these 2 themes overlap, tonight's focus will be on visible unity, and tomorrow's focus will be on living the apostolic faith together. Now, many churches and communions are celebrating and commemorating Nicaea, along with other special denominational anniversaries. And so there's lots going on for Christians to celebrate and commemorate in this year. I am using a kind of trifocal lens for my work tonight. My faith and order experience at the WCC, my participation and dialogue in the 20th and 21st century, especially in Canada, but also beyond, and then through my own desire to be a faithful follower of Jesus in a beautiful and deeply troubled world. So when I ask if we are ready, I am thinking primarily of those intersecting communities of we. But I'm also quite aware that it's wrong and dangerous to imagine that I can speak for any collective we. So I intend my we to be that kind of friendly preacher, teachers we that asks us to come on in and reflect together. And I hope we can explore questions and offer suggestions that might take us into 2025 with curiosity and hope. Now, I'm going to do something a little unusual. I'm going to have a kind of narrative epigraph at the beginning, and I'm going to have a postscript at the end of our presentation today. So I'm going to preface our exploration of visible unity with a vignette. It comes from the early modern period, the years roughly 1500 to 1800. Now, historians tend to view those years as grim times for Christian unity, especially in Europe. Reformations, counter-reformation, wars of religion, further splits, so much bloodshed, so much bitter division. But Dutch historian Benjamin Kaplan took another look, and he discovered instances of religious toleration occurring throughout this divisive era. Now, one of these occurred in 1628 in a small town called Gap in the French Alps. Anybody been there to Gap? No, I haven't either. Gap had endured bitter rivalries between its Catholic and Protestant Huguenot inhabitants, including a brutal attack led by Protestants from a nearby town 50 years prior that had destroyed the Gap Cathedral. But in 1628, the Catholics were busy preparing for a local jubilee, and there was going to be a procession through town. The Catholic children were thrilled. Their mothers made them costumes, boys dressed as angels and girls as virgins. The Protestant children, though, wanted to dress up too. They wanted to process as angels and virgins. They begged and pleaded, and finally their parents relented, and the Huguenot and Catholic children marched together and sang together joyfully in the procession. Well, when the local priests realized that heretics had joined their procession, they were scandalized and began to chase the Protestant children away. But the bishop, the savvy bishop, got wind of the scene. He ordered his priests to let the children march. That evening, the Huguenot children went home and proudly declared to their parents, "We are Catholics too." And the story, as told by the Catholic missionaries, was that nothing could dissuade these young children. They were Catholics for life. Now, Kaplan, the author, cautions that the missionaries may not have been entirely reliable on that point. And then he says that it was quite natural for the children to be attracted to Catholicism, in part because Catholicism was simply more fun, which perhaps we logocentric Protestants should consider. But his real point in telling the story, and my point in placing it at the beginning of a discussion of Christian unity, is that it's hard to keep people apart. They find one another, and once they are able to see one another up close, mixing and even marriage can happen. And then carefully constructed faith structures can be compromised, or they can be enriched. Well, in a world where children are so terribly vulnerable, where the largest age group being murdered in a genocide is children aged 5 to 9, where the unhoused in Saskatoon, include more than ever before families with children, I remember that Jesus set a child before the disciples to tell them how they might enter the kingdom. And so may this small vignette of a moment of visible unity brought to us by small children help us keep perspective on the gospel task we undertake tonight. So, here's a little outline of our time together. What was the Council of Nicaea? How did Nicaea make unity visible? Are we ready for visible unity? And then 3 possibilities. Yes, yes, but, and maybe if. And then my little postscript, and I hope time that you will participate in some your thoughts and sharing your questions. So, what was Nicaea? Nicaea 325. Well, the WCC cautions that this is not just to be a year about Nicaea, that its significant anniversary provides the impetus to explore faith and unity. But if it is to be a touchstone for us, we need to know something of the shape and the texture of the stone we are touching. And Faith and Order also knows this, and they're preparing documents to help people understand the Council of Nicaea. Besides, history can be fun. Trust me. Trust me, please. The Council of Nicaea was the first gathering that sought to bring Christian leaders, bishops, and some clergy together from all over the empire to meet and to make decisions. The Roman Emperor Constantine called and hosted it in a small city at the eastern end of what was then called Lake Ascania in what is now northwestern Turkey. Constantine urged the bishops to come speedily, and he promised them pleasant weather. It was a complex affair, and there's much that we don't know about it. There is no surviving minute book because Presbyterianism hadn't been invented yet. Exactly who attended the Council of Nicaea, when it started, and even precisely how the sessions and discussions unfolded are all matters of what one scholar calls calculated guesswork. So, the meeting lasted about 6 or 7 weeks in late May, beginning in late May or early June and into early July. We don't have an accurate attendance list. Rather, we have several conflicting lists of the bishops who attended. But despite the traditional claim that 318 bishops attended, better estimates are 200 to 250. Most conspicuously absent was the Bishop of Rome, Sylvester, who was represented nonetheless by 2 presbyters, Vitus and Vicentius. There is also no good evidence, I'm sad to say, that Nicholas of Myra was there, although he served as bishop at the time of the council and he would have been invited, so perhaps no Santa Claus at the council. The event was, though, magnificent in its size and scope. The whole gathering likely totaled around 2,000 people, including the bishop's assistants and the imperial officials. And then behind the scenes, of course, there were women and men, many of them likely enslaved persons, who provided food and lodging and transportation for all of this to happen. Now, scholars, fiction writers, and ordinary Christians debate the Emperor Constantine's motives and contributions in calling and attending the council. We know he contributed frequently to the discussions, but he did not officially chair the proceedings. And he did not have a vote. He was actively interested in Christian theology, and he wanted doctrinal clarity and accuracy, but that was, as one scholar puts it, of far less concern to him than arriving at a consensus that would achieve unity and lead to peace. He was likely looking to the Christians, who were strategically located all across his empire, to strengthen and unify it. The council produced a letter, a creed, 20 canons or other pieces of doctrine, and 3 excommunicated Christians, including Arius. And Constantine got, at least for the moment, the unity and peace he wanted. Now, I tend to think about the Council of Nicaea as a creed, a council, and a context. Now, the creed gets almost all the attention since it has been the lasting instrument of unity. We will address that tomorrow, so you can all truck on down to Regina or join the live stream. The council, the conciliar process, gets much less attention, and we will address that shortly. And the context will kind of weave its way through both presentations, but I'd like to say a little bit about it now. It tends to be the least considered and in some ways the most divisive aspect of Nicaea today, especially because it was so deeply embedded in the empire. For several centuries, the church called Constantine a model Christian emperor and granted him the title Is Apostolos, equal to the apostles. Some churches continue to hold that view. Others, however, and especially many Protestants and certainly Anabaptists, consider the emperor's presence to be a problem, if not a travesty. This founding moment in church history, they argue, wedded the church to the state and has led to the church's participation in all the evils of empire. Constantine's legalization and normalization of Christianity and his ongoing engagement, most clearly manifested at Nicaea, led, many argue, to what is often called the Constantinian captivity of the church. However, as historians point out, the separation of church and state is a modern invention. In ancient societies, every state was also a religious institution. And so, and then closer to home, on this very stage here at STM a few years ago, the Catholic deacon and Indigenous education scholar Harry Lafon noted during a panel on religion and politics that in Indigenous communities, politics is, in modern terms, religious ceremony. So we see that sort of wedding, no separation between what happens politically and what happens in people's religious lives and ceremonies. Now, I don't mean to suggest that we therefore absolve the church of all of its complicity in empire in any age. We do, however, need to consider the very different world of the churches of the 4th century as we assess their actions. Further, and perhaps awkwardly, without Constantine's largesse and that of subsequent emperors, would the Christian church have blossomed and survived into the 21st century? We can't know, but we need to ponder that question too. Perhaps, or what's more contextually interesting to me in some ways, is the sheer marvel that Nicaea happened at all. Here we have a humble religious sect, significantly populated by enslaved persons and heavy on women's participation, only a decade after the end of a brutal imperial persecution. And this sect now finds its leaders gathered from the ends of a vast empire to sit together and find common cause on matters of faith and practice. These bishops in council managed both to imagine a unified Christianity and to struggle to a fragile consensus. Now, that moment, perhaps flawed, perhaps compromised, nonetheless unites Christians worldwide, despite all the ways they and we have divided since then from one another. And I think that is a compelling reason to remember Nicaea and use it as a touchstone for our ecumenical work today. So, how did Nicaea find unity? Let's find that out. How did it find the unity it expressed in its creed and its canons? Nicaea was perhaps not the ideal ecumenical conference. Its creed ended with condemnations. Not everyone went home happy. In fact, the bitter divisions continued long after the councils. Some Eastern councils issued their own alternative creeds for a time. Constantine's imperial successors took differing opinions on Nicene faith, and pro-Nicene bishops, including Athanasius of Alexandria, he hadn't been a bishop at the Council of Nicaea, but was subsequently, they found themselves deposed and then exiled and then reinstated, and sometimes more than once. Yet, its creed did persist, although slightly reworked over the years, so that Nicene faith has stood for centuries as the one Christian statement of faith that has been accepted as truly ecumenical. Its canons were also held in high regard into the 5th century and beyond, although few scholars have traced their long-term influence of those canons. The creed itself is tomorrow's topic. Today, it's interesting to ask what it took for the bishops to come to unity. Well, from what contemporary scholars can glean, in some ways, except for the emperor's presence, Nicaea looked not unlike contemporary church gatherings. The presider, Bishop Osius of Cordova, Spain, who deserved a medal, as most presiders do, was seasoned in church synods, and especially in those that had debated the views of Arius. Now, Osius prepared the agenda and he kept order. There were lively debates, not only about the Father-Son relationship in the Trinity, but of course also about the date of Easter, and tricky issues relating to church discipline and the fallout of the long Diocletian persecution. The bishops sometimes appeared to agree readily, and other times they compromised. There were factions. There was a small subcommittee set apart to draft the creed and present it to the plenary. Does any of this sound familiar to you? The further removed the accounts are of the council in time, because people wrote about it for decades after, the more colorful they become. They often feature bishops dramatically destroying offending documents. The historian Rufinus, for example, 70 years after the council, describes Constantine receiving petitions from two rival clergy who each brought charges against each other. Constantine was the kind of person who did try to reconcile some of these disputes, but did he really take the two letters in hand and burn them both publicly as a kind of demand for unity? Well, there's no corroborating evidence, but the story points to the role the emperor may have played in keeping everyone in the room. What did it take then to produce a unity statement in 325 CE? Ultimately, it took a committed leadership, group perseverance, personal flexibility, the willingness to work towards consensus, and most of all, an overwhelming desire that the Christian church, in all its diversity, would be a shining example of the oneness of the body of Christ, so thoroughly united that a Roman emperor could imagine it helping to bring peace to his realm. So, to the heart of the matter then, are we ready for visible unity? Are we, our church traditions, our parishes, ourselves, are we prepared to respond finally and fully to the scripture call to be peacemakers, that there be no divisions among us, that we clothe ourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony? Now, as you saw in the outline, I'm suggesting we can answer that question three ways. So let's begin with yes. We have everything we need. We have the experience of over a century of modern dialogue and relationship building. We have impassioned speeches from ecumenical pioneers, including the Canadian-born Anglican bishop, Bishop Charles Brent there, and Orthodox Metropolitan Germanos at the top, at the First World Conference on Faith and Order in 1927, along with speakers from as far away as India and China, radiating assurance in the Spirit's call to unity. From 1948, we have the famous pledge suggested by pioneering ecumenist Kathleen Bliss, the picture there, for inclusion in the message of the newly minted World Council of Churches, we intend to stay together. And the 1964 Decree on Ecumenism described a certain, though imperfect, communion of Christians even before the reforms of the Second Vatican Council had begun to take hold. We have libraries full of international and national dialogue texts, great and promising agreements on formerly church-dividing issues. Canadian church history is peppered with church union, full communion agreements, powerful shared work for justice and other outreach. Ecumenically shared ministries, as Nick mentioned, one of my passions, currently over 100 local parishes across the country in those. Shared ministries in hospital, prison, and university chaplaincies, ecumenically constituted theological colleges, and of course shared youth work. The Canadian Council of Churches, through its 26 member churches, and we are pleased to have the president of the Canadian Council of Churches in the room with us tonight. Amanda, thank you for being here. It's great to have Amanda Curry, one of our own, is the president of the Canadian Council of Churches. Those 26 member churches collectively represent 85% of all the Christians in Canada. Amazing. And please check out the Margaret O'Gara Dialogue Collection. You'll see that there it is there, but you can just type in Margaret O'Gara Dialogue and you'll get it. We are deeply indebted to Nick Jessen, whose careful attention to every single ecumenical document ever produced in the history of the world, it's amazing, helped to bring this website to life. And it features no less than 19 different dialogues in Canada, just in Canada, and there are multiple reports. We have all that. As the topics of dialogue have evolved, so have our approaches and our understanding to what we're doing. Margaret O'Gara, a beloved mentor to so many of us, described ecumenical dialogue as an exchange of gifts in which the giver gets to keep the gift that they're giving and receive the gift of the other. I do recall Archbishop Don Bolin reflecting that he wasn't sure who might want to receive the gift of the primacy of the Bishop of Rome. But that's the point of this gifting idea. It requires generosity and grace both on the part of the giver and the recipient. And Paul Murray, a British Catholic ecumenist, to whom some of you will remember as a lecturer in the de Margerie series, developed a variation of the gift exchange called the receptive ecumenism. It asserts that the primary ecumenical responsibility is not to ask, what do other people have to learn from me or us, but what do we need to learn from other traditions? So both gift exchange and receptive ecumenism intend to expand our dialogue by understanding it not simply as propositional statements that we aim at one another, but as an exercise in vulnerability and humility and gratitude and mutual discernment. And to be clear, our dialogue reports are not arcane and dusty. Okay, well, most of the time they're not arcane. And they're only dusty if no one takes them off the shelf. They breathe with the possibilities that Christians imagine when they come together. One of my favorite examples comes from the document Towards a Common Understanding of the Church, produced in 1990 by the International Reformed Roman Catholic Dialogue. It offers two conceptions of the Church. One is creatura verbi, or creation of the Word, and the other is sacrament of grace. Now you can probably guess which one represents which tradition. The first, the creation of the Word, is described as more Reformed in character, while the second is more Roman Catholic, a sacrament of grace. Now the document goes on to suggest that these two conceptions are not opposite poles or things to battle about, but rather they become poles of a creative tension between our churches. They're like two sides of a coin, they say. We can examine both of them and find new riches in them. And right away, for me, a wall begins to crumble. Peering through the cracks, we see not a dangerous stranger over there, but another facet of one diamond, that gospel treasure that we would buy a field to obtain. There may be tension, but it's one that pulls us towards better listening and learning. And that's what this endless parade of ecumenical documents invites us to do, to experience faith in fresh and startling ways that draw us closer to one another as churches and as believers. They help foster compassion for that ecumenical other. Even if we can't agree, we can understand one another better. Now, if sometimes these documents move our hearts and minds and imaginations, other times they accomplish explicit steps towards forward and even visible unity in some places. Churches globally and nationally have lifted anathemas, formed united and uniting churches, and entered multiple agreements on full communion and mutual recognition of ministries. And we must not forget our very own Plura agreement, whereby in 1975, the Presbyterian, Lutheran, United, and Roman Catholic and Anglican churches, Plura, nice handy thing, acronym, agreed to recognize the validity of each other's baptism. So, happy 50th birthday we can add to the celebration, to that amazing ecumenical milestone, the recognition of those baptism, of one another's baptism. Now, these documents, these accomplishments, are part of the old and new things that the scribes trained for the kingdom pull out of the household treasure chest. So they form part of the yes that makes us ready for visible unity. However, well, so surely we have all we need for visible unity, right? And one would think so, but we can't claim to be entirely there yet. This challenge, which is often that vexed question of reception of our impressive dialogue achievements, puzzles and confounds us as ecumenists. Does anybody know what that scene comes from? Yes, bingo, you get a prize. The Pirates of Penzance, yes. Maybe some of you have acted in it or sung in it. Yes, so it reminds me of a scene from Gilbert and Sullivan's Pirates of Penzance. A group of police officers are nervously waiting outside the Major General's home because they are supposed to go into battle with a band of pirates. Now, the lovely young women, who are the Major General's wards, are urging the policemen on to their glorious deaths, which doesn't help, while the police officers kind of cringe and dither and hesitate, and that's what they're doing there. Eventually, though, they kind of gather themselves up and try to sing heartily, we go, several times, while staying more or less put. The Major General gets increasingly exasperated. Finally, after he hears one more, we go, he shouts back at them, yes, but you don't go. So why is it that we, the churches, the people of God, 1,700 years after we pledged our common faith, over 100 years since the rekindling of the fires of unity, 72 years after the Lund Principle exhorted the churches to act together in all matters, except those in which deep differences of conviction compel them to act separately, even as we say in our texts and prayers, we go, why is it that so often we don't go, or at least we don't go far enough to make our unity visible? Well, here are some possibilities. The changed religious landscape is perhaps the most frequently cited reason that we don't go. The ecumenical excitement stirred up by the decree on ecumenism coincided in Canada almost directly with the beginning of the decline of membership in Canadian mainstream churches in the 1960s. Churches across what we call the West have since the 1960s not only lost members, but social and political influence in the surge of untrammeled capitalism and acceleration of secularization that's familiar to all of us. Churches have fewer resources and spread them even more thinly. Now, even though unity could help us with our perceived scarcity, sometimes the energy is just not even there to promote it. In the late 1980s, after the initial enthusiasm about the 1982 document, convergence text, Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry, which we call BEM, if you're a real cool ecumenist, you just say BEM, even seasoned ecumenists started to get disheartened. Is the patient, sometimes plodding work towards visible unity an outdated mid-20th century project based now on tarnished Enlightenment views? Well, another convergence text, The Church Towards a Common Vision, released in 2013, received a total of 78 responses, total. And as you can see there, BEM, beginning in 1982, received over 160 responses from different national churches alone, and then not counting responses from organizations or individuals, which some of these ones for TCTCV were. So there was we see the decline in kind of enthusiasm even for these really important dialogue texts. Meanwhile, the churches located where Christianity is growing, especially in Africa and Asia, have not historically been part of the ecumenical project. So that's not, you won't be surprised to hear me say those things. Another reason that we sometimes give for not knowing and not finding ourselves in visible unity is we're not sure we know what it means. Now, in Amsterdam, in 1948, the WCC made clear that its goal as an entity was the visible unity of the churches. It made clear very shortly after that, it wasn't going to be the super church, but its goal was that the churches would unite in visible unity. And the bylaws of the Faith and Order Commission, which does most of the work at the World Council specifically on questions of Christian unity, they state that visible unity in one faith and one Eucharistic fellowship expressed in worship and common life in Christ through witness and service to the world so that the world may believe is the goal. It's a big goal, isn't it? Sometimes now you'll hear the word koinonia replace the term visible unity. Koinonia, communion, but both terms actually elude clear definition. In 1950, the WCC executive meeting in Toronto, as I said, made clear that the goal was not a single institutional church or even a particular model of unity, but it could not simply be spiritual unity, so we weren't going to get away with that. Susan Derber, another former de Margerie lecturer and past moderator of Faith and Order, and now the European president of Faith and Order of the World Council, helpfully asserts that Christian unity requires both mutual recognition, that is, the unity we see in ourselves and in each other in our churches, and the visible unity that the world sees. So we can't just say, hey, look at us, we're all good at this. And the church says, and the world says, yeah, but how come there's a church over there and a church over there and you don't get to take communion in that one, right? So there's those two pieces to unity. And then she also points out that the challenge that the church is both the body of Christ and by necessity an organization, right? Now, how do these intersect when we're trying to understand what visible unity means? Many responses to the church towards a common vision indicated a desire to move away from complex doctrinal agreements to more possible goals, like shared service, justice work, and simply sharing the gospel together. And that often falls under the term reconciled diversity, which is quite popular. However, theologian Jürgen Moltmann saw that as a limited model of unity. And he called it the sleeping pill of the ecumenical movement, allowing us to be nice to each other without truly reconciling. But this model is popular because it helps us contend with contemporary challenges such as thorny and divisive moral issues or the desire to embrace the complexities of diversity, which we do understand to be a gift of God. So it's handy to be able to say, well, let's find easier things to say make us united. But I think I'm with Dr. Moltmann. Well, he's in heaven, but my mind is with him. Until we can commune together and recognize each other's ministries, are we really visibly reconciled? We need to think about that more, I think. And then there's the kind of invisible visible unity of truly integrated ecumenism. Like, when does a united church become just one more denomination, right? Or what is it when the Prairie Center for Ecumenism Vacation Bible School is so seamlessly ecumenical that you scarcely see denominations anywhere, but then at the start of lunch, the children from several traditions all cross themselves before singing Johnny Appleseed without batting an eye. What indeed is visible unity? It's tricky. And finally, in terms of why we don't go, thirdly, I believe that, like Gilbert and Sullivan's poor, nervous police officers, in our churches and within ourselves, fear holds us back. When I'm working with congregations working towards ecumenical shared ministries, and some of you here have partnered around that, I have often seen one partner, a potential partner, withdraw from the relationship somewhere fairly far into the process, but before everything's signed on the dotted line. And the reasons they offer are often vague, but underlying them, I think I see fear often of losing control, losing power, of having to share, the fear of having to compromise a treasured value, even if those guiding the process have given assurances that in shared ministries we don't have to leave those commitments behind. Many centuries of division seem to have imprinted caution when encountering the religious other. Meanwhile, most church denominations have adopted the branding language to advertise their distinctiveness and set them apart. And so I've put a couple of them there. And it's not that any of their slogans are bad, it's the fact that we want to make sure we distinguish ourselves from those guys over there. Retired Swedish Lutheran Archbishop Antje Jackelin perceptively notes, baptism is citizenship, but we treat the baptized instead like consumers. I think that's an interesting question or comment that she poses. In some way or other, then, I think we may fear that ecclesiastical pirates will take us hostage. So, you'll be pleased to hear that the plot of Pirates of Penzance does end happily. All the police officers live, and the pirates too, and the young women. And I believe that there are ways that our saga of visible unity can also find its way to a happy conclusion. So I will suggest 3 considerations. You'll have others to offer, and there will be 10 or so speakers asked to address visible unity specifically at the World Conference in October. And so far, we're just getting the list together, but so far they come from Europe, Africa, Asia, North America, and at least 7 different church traditions. So they will truly enlarge the conversation, but I'll start with 3 things. And here are the first 2. One is that we broaden the table. And as a way of reckoning with the low response rate that the Church Towards a Common Vision received, especially among the churches of the Global South, Faith and Order commissioners began and continue to pursue a process of both broadening the table regionally to engage intentionally in better dialogue with churches in the Global South, and broadening the table denominationally using the Church Towards a Common Vision as its starting point. So they used TCTCV and the dialogues that they had with folks from these other traditions and other places to find if they could find key themes in ecclesiology. And the new Faith and Order Commission, appointed in 2023, is not only the most diverse in terms of the regions that it represents, but it has members from non-member churches who bring creative and energetic insights to the work, and some wonderful Pentecostals. And we are privileged to have, David Wells. Thank you, David. And you better shout out your Okay, General Superintendent of the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada, but also involved in the World Pentecostal Fellowship, and very engaged in helping bring us some wonderful Pentecostal theologians to the table. And I think these members, paradoxically, although they're adding more diversity, they'll actually help foster unity, partly through their fresh ideas, partly by reminding us of the depth and breadth of the body of Christ. So the broadening the table, I think, can help us towards that unity rather than hinder us, reminding us of how expansive Jesus' church really is. And then another way we might help ourselves towards visible unity, is to focus on the power of dialogue and the processes of dialogue. Now, those of us who've been fortunate to participate in formal or structured ecumenical dialogue at any level, local, regional, national, international, we often say that what we treasured most was the experience itself, the friendships, the discoveries, the personal transformation. Yves Congar, who was a pioneering Roman Catholic ecumenist, reflected eloquently in the 1960s on his experience of ecumenical dialogue as entailing a process of rebirth. He said it involves a truly evangelical readiness to refuse nothing that is of God. Nothing that is of God. So that's a bit Methodist, Nick, but that was a Catholic. It has been exciting for me to see younger ecumenists, especially in the United States and Canada, pick up the question of what dialogue does and how. So here are three just little examples. Russell Johnson, American, Mennonite, describes the enemy love that's demanded of critical dialogue. He says we have to learn strategies and process for loving the enemy if we're going to be in dialogue. Catherine Reinhard works with the work of Paul Ricoeur to consider the role of mutual recognition in dialogue, in transforming not just the church mutual recognition, but transforming each of us who seeks recognition and the one offering to recognize the other. And Ricoeur talks about really we exist in that tension, all of us as human beings. We exist as people who need recognition from others and who can give recognition to others. That's how we interact as human beings. And then Elizabeth Nicholson, a Canadian ecumenist, studies how specific processes developed in conflict mediation based on the work of Bernard Lonergan can both describe and strengthen ecumenical dialogue, if you can understand Bernard Lonergan. And she does. So these people they're not looking at a particular thing we're arguing about, but they're looking at the process itself. What makes dialogue work and what is special about it? What does it do for us? And I think maybe training, the understanding of the anatomy of dialogue might help ecumenists address more honestly what happens in dialogue, including the power dynamics that are at play when we dialogue together, but it also might help train more of us in the way of dialogue. What if we train more people? And back to what Karen was saying last year about the faithful being the keepers of being the stewards of doctrine. What if the faithful were also the stewards of dialogue, itself? And we assumed that to be a Christian was to be in dialogue with the other. I think that could make us better Christians and more likely to find unity. And finally, now don't you just love to hear that word finally in a lecture? Finally, maybe we will find visible unity, or more correctly, it will find us, if we want it badly enough. The unity statement of the World Council of Churches meeting at Karlsruhe in 2022 focused on ecumenism of the heart. And it stated, the work of unity needs to be inspired anew by the love we have seen in Jesus Christ. When we are drawn to one another out of compassion, fascination, and longing for one another across our differences and divisions, we will find the grace to search for that common faith, the truth held together that will overcome our separation, unquote. Now, in my experience, ecumenists already share that longing. What will it take for all of us and our churches both to share it and to act on the fruits of that longing and that compassion and that fascination? Now, the bishops at Nicaea were there at the behest and expense of an emperor who, despite or as well as being murderous and calculating, was determined to foster, for whatever reason, the peace and visible unity of the global Christian church. Constantine, as best as we can determine, kept them at it until they found it. The emperors of our age, unfortunately, I think, are not interested in peace and visible unity unless it will cover their own greed and duplicity, or as commentator Ahmad Ibn Sa'is put it last week, the burning in Gaza and the burning in Los Angeles are all part of, quote, a system that values conquest over conservation, profit over people, and expansion over existence, unquote. So we need to find our compelling motivation somewhere else. Now, the decree on ecumenism warned the faithful in 1964 that Christian division, some of you will know this very well as openly contradicting the will of Christ, scandalizes the world and damages that most holy cause, the preaching of the gospel to every creature. So, would we do it for the world? Naim Atik is a Palestinian Anglican priest and liberation theologian in Jerusalem. Last year, when he was asked the most important thing the churches could do for Palestine in these difficult days, he replied, "Find a common date for Easter." Really? Yes, he was serious. A common date for Easter would bring badly needed visible unity to help bring justice to the beleaguered churches of Palestine, he said. Now, Jerry Pillay, the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, said on his Canadian visit in December, and see, I was paying attention, Amanda, he said, "Unity and justice are like two wings of a bird. Both are required to fly." Would the opportunity to model solidarity and collectively cry for justice in a hurting world do it? Would that help us long for unity long enough to truly go for it? What would it take for us, for our church traditions? In 1927, Charles Bent, who founded the First World Conference on Faith and Order with many helpers, said, "Christ appeals to us to hush our prejudices, to sit lightly to our opinions, to look on the things of others as though they were our very own. All of this without slighting the convictions of our hearts or loyalty to God. It can be done," he said. "It must be done." Now, to my ears, that sounds pretty Pauline, like charisms of the apostolic faith. And I believe in order to desire and act on our compassion and fascination, we need to be, as churches and as persons, steeped in, imprinted by the common faith that formed us, saved us, and sends us into the embrace of the ecumenical other. Now, we will take up that aspect of the legacy of Nicaea, living the apostolic faith together today, tomorrow. But that's what I'd like to leave us with now. Meanwhile, I promised a postscript, and I have permission to share this. Early on a dark, cold morning, a few weeks ago, I was eating breakfast when my phone pinged. It was Mei Ling, a student at the Nanjing Union Theological Seminary, the largest seminary of the China Christian Council, which is the Union Church that brings together all the historic Protestant denominations in China. Its 30 million members constitute 2% of China's population. I met Mei Ling last year while visiting my husband, Bill, who last year and then again this year taught at Nanjing Seminary for a semester each year. She is, Mei Ling, like many Chinese Christians, an adult convert. She felt an absence in her life, and her sister said, "Well, maybe you could try a church." So she wandered into one that she passed daily on her bicycle, and now she's a ministry student. It was getting to be late evening for Mei Ling, my breakfast, but she was breathless, if text messages can be breathless, with excitement. "We talked a lot tonight with Father Bill. We talked about the Eucharist, about the Orthodox Church, Catholic Church, Protestant Church," she texted. Now, for complex reasons, Catholics and Protestants in China are considered different religions, and the Orthodox are a small minority still in the process of obtaining the status of religion. So most seminary students would not be aware of or even really curious about ecumenical activity in China. Ping, another text came in. I recently went several times to the Catholic Church for Mass, and I have joined the choir. I am quite interested in how the Catholic Christians find Jesus and worship him. I told her that was great news, and then ecumenist that I am, I texted her some information about the search for Christian unity. A little while later, ping, mailing again. I have to do my homework now, but I am so thankful that I can know more about the Lord from the Catholic Church. I hope that Unity Day is coming soon. So do I, dear Mei Ling. So do I. Thank you. Now, I believe they are trusting me to take my own questions, although, Nick, are you looking at anything on the chat too? Or on the online?
Yes, I'm watching the chat. No questions have come up yet.
Okay.
But, you could remind them online.
Okay, so you can be reminded online that you can put questions in the chat, and Nick Jessen, if he sees them, will will read them out to us or summarize them for us. But there's also, we have a microphone, thank you, and anyone that wants, and comment, ideas, things I got wrong.
Sandra, I have a question to start us off with. And maybe this is something you want to deal with tomorrow instead of today, but I'm thinking about the role of the creed itself. And it as a, sometimes it's being used as an identity marker for Christian faith, and sometimes as a way of professing the faith. But sometimes it's also being used in some pretty damaging ways to exclude or to punish, right? And so I'm wondering about that. You know, if
That is kind of tomorrow, Nick. Okay. Sorry. If I told you today, no one would listen tomorrow. But yes, you're right. I'll just say, yes, the Nicene Creed is not, as we will talk about tomorrow, isn't just the perfect instrument of unity that we just assume it would be if everybody just said it and got on with it. Right, thank you. So, but you're right, that's tomorrow. I had to have 2 lectures, right? 1 council, 2 lectures. Unless you wanted a whole council, or we could have talked about all the canons of the council, which are very interesting, a lot of them, including a little mention that suggests that there were ordained women deacons in some places, but, well, yeah. But that, we're not doing that either right now, unless you ask. Any other thoughts or questions? Oh, Jacob has one, yeah.
Well, I was going to ask about female deacons.
Okay.
And there's been a step taken in Africa about that. The first female deacon in the Orthodox Church being ordained to the full diaconate in May, I think it was.
Okay.
And I just, in light of Nicaea, would you just put some color on that?
Yeah, well, actually, it's an interesting, it's kind of a negative, it's a funny canon because it's about the readmission of some Christians who were considered sort of heretics for various reasons, and they were being readmitted, and they were saying that their priests had to be reordained, and that their deaconesses would have to be reordained too. But then they realized, I don't think there are any deaconesses in this group that has to be readmitted. But that all got in there, which implies that at some point they must have known of ordained deaconesses. So, and this is the 4th century, and we have other evidence too, but it's just right there in these canons from Nicaea that have come to us. So there's a lot of interest in pursuing that. But it's sort of in a funny kind of negative way. Oh, right, we don't have to reordain them because they weren't ordained in the first place, those ones. Oops. It's a church council, right? Think about a church council, what they do. Yeah, thanks for asking about that. Yeah. Any other comments? Yeah.
And I have a grumpy, tired baby here with me. So
Doing very well if grumpy and tired. There are probably a lot of grumpy, tired people here. They empathize.
So pardon me if I maybe missed, and I'm asking maybe something you already said. I guess I'm thinking about, so dialogue and having local church dialogue. I mean, sorry to reference Karen Peterson Finch when you're lecturing, but I mean, she had some good stuff to say on this. But, you know, from your perspective, when there's all this really interesting dialogue going on, this World Council, in Egypt, is it? Sounds very interesting. How do we bring that all home?
Yeah.
How do we wade through all that? Because I think this sounds so interesting.
Right.
I go online. Okay, never mind. There's way too much here. How do we wade into that?
Right.
For local dialogue?
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good question. And yes, and and Karen, I loved her, you know, her engaging with people around that. Well, I can give this, I've probably talked about this before with people, but several of us here were involved in a local Roman Catholic United Church dialogue, and we just decided that we would discuss the church towards a common vision document. So we were lay and ordained people, and we came together once a month, right? We did it for once a month over about 6 months. Yeah, and we just we read the text together and walked through it, and then we said, like, what stands out for us? What do we hear? And we had this amazing dialogue. The United Church was ready for papal primacy any day, as long, practically. Well, you know, but a primacy is a model of of unity. You know, we were there. So I think that, you know, the bigger question you say, like, yeah, there's so much you could dialogue, and almost you could just take any. Some dialogues come with kind of study guides attached to them too. So I guess the better question is, like, should some of us who know what these dialogues are be producing, you know, suggestions for people for local dialogues? I think that's a really interesting question, and we could take that up. Like, you know, here, would you like to, you know, here's a text that you might enjoy discussing together, and all you need to do is find a neighboring church. It doesn't have, you know, you don't have to make it really massive, and, you know, and get some people together, and then you wrestle with it, and you start, and of course, I mean, the big thing is you do get to know each other. We used to have a little supper together, a really simple soup supper, and then, you know, it was beautiful. And several of us are here tonight remembering that. You know, isn't that interesting that we're still here? Maybe it's partly because we got to do that, but it's a really good question. It's sort of overwhelming, and it's overwhelming even when you're supposed to do it for a living. So, yeah, absolutely. And I'm hoping out of, like, okay, so my goal, but whether they'll make it happen, my goal is that for Egypt, there will be a way for people to form their own clusters, either in person or online, to watch together. Now, because of the time zone differences, you'd probably watch them recorded, but watch all the plenary addresses together. Most of those are going to be short and a number of speakers, so you're going to get a lot of people speaking. Watch them together, and then have kind of some guidelines for people to have facilitated conversation about that as it's happening in Egypt. You know, people all around the world could be discussing it themselves, and maybe, and if it's at all possible, feeding some of what they're thinking about back into the Egypt process. So I think you're asking a really important question. Yeah. Okay, good. Well, you and I should talk after, if you have before you leave with the grumpy baby, right?
Sandra, we have a question from online, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, so I hope whoever this is online that I'm accurately sort of posing a question here. They're talking about their experience with sort of culture war issues coming into their church, and how that has fragmented their church community, and sort of how do we deal with some of the culture war noise and in the ecumenical circles, and when we're talking about dialogue, and then especially, are there issues around, you know, sort of wokeness or reactionariness, that kind of a thing?
Right. Yeah. Well, and that There's a lot in that question that's really important. I think, first of all, to say that the hardest stuff to dialogue about like on the Faith and Order Commission, the people that have the hardest time are the people trying to work with the moral questions, right? Those are the things that, we can, although people can clash about anything, but those moral questions, we hold them deeply. We can't just say, you're right and I'm right, because it doesn't quite work that way. And so there are processes that folks have tried to come up with to help when there are these kind of deep divisions like that, to not to begin at the point of saying, so can you all kiss and make up, but how can we hear each other? How can we hear each other across this bitterness and this difference? And there's no perfect solution, but I was mentioning this Russell Johnson, he talks about, like, it's really hard work, but you have to be willing to kind of to de-escalate what's going on, and that has to happen on everybody's part. So that's the challenge, right? Because there may be people that just don't want to let go of anything, but you have to figure out ways to, and then he talks about this, love the enemy. So and he has a whole process of cultivating a kind of love for the other who is just not where you are and antagonistic. That isn't really helpful in the short term, except to say that, yeah, it's real and it's something that needs to be addressed before you can, get into other kinds of dialogue. Yeah.
Sandra, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for the
Brenda.
great lecture.
She's my pastor, so that's good.
Good to be here. I'm just wondering if you can make some comments on, like when there's a common threat, like we saw this right around Canada, the 51st, state,
Yeah.
and suddenly we come together as Canadians, right, to
Yeah.
kind of meet head on something that's kind of pushing at us. So we do experience that in the church. We're in decline. All of us are. So how might that kind of pressure encourage unity among us? Or
Yeah.
is that something that could be held up positively as we continue to be commonly in decline and in a post-Christian world?
Well, you're right, and it actually has some. There have been I've heard a retired Lutheran bishop from amongst us, who's not here tonight, say, I believe that church decline was God's will, because it forces us to work together as Christians, and so we do think that. There was a fellow in the 1970s. I am answering your question, Brenda, honestly. In the 1970s, who was a United Church minister who got very involved in ecumenical shared ministry congregations on Vancouver Island. And that's where Bishop Remy Deroux was there. So the Catholics were very integrated into these, as best as possible, into these ecumenical formations as well. And he got very involved with the Anglican, his Anglican United Church partners and parishioners, and somebody interviewed him a number of years after he had left Vancouver. I think he was retired, from Vancouver Island, and he says, "Oh, people used to say to me, oh, you're just getting into that stuff because you're poor and you don't have enough resources," and he said, there's something in the gospel about being poor and blessed, I think. So it certainly can be. It can be absolutely the richest, wonderful thing that we have been, and you look at, I always remember meeting some Christians from Pakistan who lived in rural Pakistan, and they absolutely did not care what denomination they were. They were Catholic and Orthodox and Protestant altogether because they were so small and somewhat under threat. And so, it sure helps. And that's why I think the Emperor Constantine kind of helped. Like, when the emperor says you got to be here, you sort of stick around, right? So you do it, you work through it. But what I found in working sometimes with shared ministries, which would be the ideal situation for for congregations that are dwindling to work together, they'll tell me they'd rather die. It's too much work. I don't want to be them. I just liked being me. And so it should work. And I guess it's probably up to those of us who are leaders in churches to encourage people to see the positive angle of that. And I sometimes see churches doing everything except suggesting that as ways of building their own capacity. But yeah, thank you. Yeah. Anybody else? No? Oh, yes.
I also want to thank you, and I want to encourage you to keep on in your work. My wife and I and a few others here were very much involved with Father de Margerie when he started in his work in bringing us together.
Yeah.
Sadly, however, all of us were also at Father de Margerie's funeral, which I think was organized in a way that was completely opposite to the way he had tried to lead his followers and lead the people in the community. It's very depressing to see the slowness of change, and we won't be in this fight or in this hopeful progress much longer, but other people, I hope, won't quit in trying to achieve this unity that only makes sense and was required of us by Christ, that we might be one.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. That's beautiful. And well, we remember the good things about Father de Margerie's funeral too, like those beautiful blessings from all the different churches and religious communities after the service and being together. I'm a Protestant, and I felt so welcome to be with all of you who were there and sharing together. So I know it's just hard to lose our pioneer in the faith like that, but we know he wants us to carry it on, and I know that you want us to carry it on, and we will. It's always the way in the church, right? That we don't see the end, the final goal, but we work towards it. Yes, 2 days ago was Martin Luther King Jr. Day in the United States, among many things in the United States 2 days ago. And, he always said, I'm not likely to get to the mountain with you. And then he was assassinated a few days later. But, he took them as far as he could. So thank you for bringing us to this point. I mean, you folks were around long before Nick and I and others were engaged, and that's, you helped us find something to work with and towards. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. I had the privilege of visiting Father de Margerie every Friday morning for the last 2 or 3 months of his life. And he was lying on his back at that point and couldn't move his head very much to see what was going on outside. But he always asked, "What's the weather? What's it like outside?" And I described to him, it was in the autumn to begin with, the leaves were there, and said, "Is it snowing?" And I said, "No." And then he said, "Well, what else do you see?" And I said, "Well, there's a rabbit out there." And he was so moved by all of that. And I think, he would be so saddened to know that the United States is saying we don't want to be part of the movement for, cultural care, that kind of thing. So, when we talk about justice, we need Father de Margerie would be proud of us if we pushed for the care of the earth.
Thank you, Bishop Rod. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, Trish.
Thanks. I've been reading an article by Werner, who's an ecumenical person, and he says that it's not the whole thing, but the issues of justice and peace and integrity of creation and global ecological problems are things that bring people together when they can't kind of see Christ in each other so easily. You can get passionate about it. And having spent some time in Moosomin in the eastern part of this province, we had a family that they were going to be deported back to Honduras because, well, they just hadn't got their papers in order and they'd been rooked by a few lawyers and so on. But they were looking for asylum in Canada, and a number of us were on the phone with Goodale and, you know, the Minister of Immigration, etc. And we worked together really hard. And all the churches. And then we came together for a meal, and I guess 3 days before, I sent an email to Goodale and I said, well, it'd be really good to get some good news on Thursday because we're having a rally. And we had 300 people there, no problem. And this family got the news at just after noon hour that they had 2 more years to put their papers in order. And that kind of energy is so beautiful when people can work together for justice and freedom and, you know, ecological issues. Like we have a lot of work to do to build the kingdom.
Yeah. Thank you. Absolutely. And I guess so for this visible unity to kind of flow out of that into why can we be passionate for this beautiful creation and for others in that way, but we can't find a way to kind of to bring ourselves actually into church together, I guess is the question, right? And so I think it's you're so right. Like, and those things are always the kind of ways to get us started. So you don't start, you don't necessarily start knocking on the door of the Pentecostal and saying, so what do you think about, the Bishop of Rome anyway? You say, let's get together and do something good for this community because we know how to do that. So absolutely, that beautiful. People here who've worked so tirelessly on NEST, right, on the refugee sponsorship, working together completely seamlessly. So it's saying, okay, we can do that, but in the eyes of the world, there are still all these divided churches. So what is it going to take for us not to be that in the eyes of the world too? So yeah, it's the great puzzle though, I think, Trish. Like, if we can have that compassion, maybe tomorrow I'll be able to, because there's some stuff in the creed that leads towards some of that. So maybe tomorrow we'll talk a little more about that. Thank you. I think we're ready for snacks.
Hi, good evening. My name is Catherine Wood, and I'm the Executive Director at the Prairie Centre for Ecumenism. On behalf of the lecture series and the planning team, I'm here to say some thank yous. First, I'd like to say thanks to all of you for joining us, either in person or online. Your presence and support of this series is very appreciated, and it would not be possible without you. I'd also like to thank our planning team. The planning team is made up of representatives and under the sponsorship of the Leslie and Irene Dubé Chair for Catholic Studies at St. Thomas More, the Saskatoon Theological Union, the Prairie Centre for Ecumenism, the Roman Catholic Diocese of Saskatoon, Campion College in Regina, and the Archdiocese of Regina. There are so many fine details when planning an event like this, and we have a good group of folks who have worked together to bring this series to you. But most of all, I'd like to express our heartfelt thanks to Sandra for the outstanding presentation tonight. I've had the privilege of working with Sandra over the last few months just going to put a plug in here, on the Ecumenical Shared Ministries toolkit that we are putting on our website. And so you'll hear more about that in the coming days, hopefully. The goal of this series and lectures and workshops was to become an annual event during the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity that would bring to Saskatoon distinguished ecumenists from around the world to motivate, inspire, and nurture our own local ecumenical activity and awareness. Sandra's presence here in Saskatchewan is a huge blessing. As members of our community in Saskatchewan, we are proud of your experience and serving as moderator of Nicaea 2025 steering group of the World Council of Churches Commission on Faith and Order. We're looking forward to your lecture tomorrow night in Regina, and as well continuing the conversation at the workshops, Friday morning at Our Saviour's Lutheran Church in Regina, and Saturday morning at Holy Covenant Evangelical Orthodox Church in Saskatoon. On behalf of STM and the planning team, I'd like to offer you a token of our gratitude. Thank you for joining us on this evening and sharing your vision and experience. Thank you for your ongoing friendship and support of the ecumenical community in Saskatchewan. We're looking forward to hearing more about the events of in this year of Nicaea 2025. Thank you.
Wow, what a wonderful evening. My name is Gertrude Rompré, and I serve as the Director of Mission and Ministry here at St. Thomas More College. I just have a few commercials to end off the day, so soon we will be heading towards the snacks. For those of you that are in Saskatoon tomorrow and near STM, the STU and St. Thomas More College are jointly sponsoring our own Week of Prayer for Christian Unity service. That's tomorrow morning at 11:40, just above us in the STM chapel, so you are all welcome to join us there. We've heard that, again, we can live stream or join in the lecture tomorrow at Campion, so please remember to do that. And last commercial, but the most important, please join us for our reception just down the hall and to the right in the atrium so that we can continue this journey this evening. So thank you all for being here, both those of you here in person and those of you joining us online. Have a good evening.